Ever consider how rock walls resisted entire armies for extended periods? Medieval fortresses were more than large residences. They were combat-ready apparatuses designed to defy expectations. Their strength resided not just in their durability, but also in their ingenuity, beginning with a fundamental query: where to construct the stronghold? Builders consistently opted for elevated terrain, hills, precipices, and craggy formations, compelling assailants to contend with gravity before even reaching the fortifications. The ultimate medieval fitness regimen: ascend a steep incline in full protection as projectiles are hurled at you. At Scotland's Edinburgh Castle, attackers endured a demanding ascent up a sheer volcanic stone that left them drained before the conflict commenced. Water features offered immediate defense on multiple sides. Castles on headlands or islets, such as Bodiam Castle, with its expansive encircling trench, established obstructions that siege apparatuses could not breach. Approach routes were deliberately made constricted, meandering, and exposed, compelling attacking forces to advance in narrow, vulnerable formations. Some castles possessed only a singular access path, while others were situated above sheer drops that eliminated entire assault vectors. Weather also functioned as a defensive ally. Winter gales would batter exposed pathways, and spring precipitation transformed dirt roads into muddy quagmires. Nothing disrupts a successful siege like discovering your weighty siege tower is gradually sinking into 6 inches of mire. At Carrickfergus Castle, frequent rainfall rendered the precipitous limestone cliff nearly impassable for safe climbing. The natural topography additionally served as a psychological weapon. Imagine marching for days only to arrive at a castle situated on an impossibly sheer precipice or encircled by perilous marshland. Many invading forces lost courage before a single projectile was launched. Records indicate that some sieges were abandoned simply because the attacking army could not devise a method to surmount the natural impediments. Forests were maintained around castles to restrict the mobility of siege machinery and provide concealment for defenders to initiate counteroffensives. Castle designers sometimes even modified the environment, fashioning artificial pools or clearing specific zones to remove concealment for advancing adversaries. These inherent defenses were merely the beginning of a castle's security architecture. Once assailants managed to reach the actual construction, they would encounter the next obstacle. Once attackers reached a castle, after contending with environmental barriers, they confronted walls specifically engineered to endure virtually anything. Medieval walls were not just immense, they were engineering marvels constructed to absorb impacts. Their sheer dimensions would astonish most modern visitors. Many castle walls stood 20 feet thick, approximately the length of a school bus. Dover Castle's walls measure nearly 21 feet at their widest point. Medieval constructors never had to fret about their patrons complaining, "I requested robust walls, not that robust." This substantial mass served a practical function in dissipating force from battering rams and other siege weaponry. Medieval wall construction employed an ingenious layering technique. Laborers erected 2 parallel stone facings and packed the void between with smaller stones, fractured debris, and binding material. This core of loose material created walls both extraordinarily sturdy and somewhat pliant, capable of absorbing impacts without fracturing. Many incorporated a sloped foundation called a talus that redirected assaults upward instead of directly into the wall, rendering battering rams less effective. It also established an awkward angle for siege ladders. Medieval builders found that a tricky incline was not merely a logical fallacy, it was a potent defensive maneuver. Sophisticated castles featured concentric walls, an outer rampart, and a taller inner barrier. This implied that even if attackers penetrated the initial wall, they would find themselves confined in a lethal zone between the walls, with defenders firing from both directions. Imagine being literally caught between a rock and a hard place. Some constructors integrated small stones into sections where enemy sappers might attempt to excavate beneath walls. These loose aggregates would shift and emit sound when disturbed, alerting guards to excavation activities. Medieval warning systems, no batteries needed, just mechanics and pebbles. While these formidable walls could endure immense punishment, ingenious attackers devised specialized armaments to overcome them. But even the most powerful siege apparatus often met its counterpart in the castle's subsequent line of defense. Gatehouses were not entries, they were snares, but for armored mice. The gatehouse represented both the most vulnerable point in castle defenses and, ironically, frequently the strongest. Medieval strategists transformed what could have been a weakness into one of history's most brilliant lethal traps. A typical gatehouse comprised multiple obstacles. First came a movable bridge spanning the moat. Behind this, heavy wooden doors reinforced with metal. But the true peril lay just beyond. The most vital defensive component was the portcullis, a heavy timber or metal grating that could be lowered from above. Many advanced gatehouses featured two portcullises positioned approximately 20 feet apart. Medieval engineers conceived the world's inaugural crumple zones long before automobile manufacturers envisioned them, except these were designed to incapacitate individuals, not absorb impact. The ceiling contained murder holes, apertures through which defenders could drop stones, boiling liquid, or ignited tar onto trapped assailants. Nothing signals an unwelcome visitor quite like a scalding oil drench from above. Some murder holes at significant castles measured over a foot wide, allowing for particularly unpleasant surprises. Arrow slits lined the walls, enabling archers to shoot from sheltered positions. These narrow openings granted defenders a broad field of vision while presenting the smallest possible target. Medieval arrow slits, the original "I perceive you, but you cannot see me" technology. The entire gatehouse was usually extended outward from the main walls, forming a three-sided kill box. This arrangement permitted defenders to inflict devastation from above and both flanks concurrently. The gatehouse at Brougham Castle protrudes nearly 40 feet beyond the primary walls, creating a lethal corridor few attackers survived. Some castle planners incorporated cunning psychological elements, such as abrupt turns that disoriented invaders and hindered battering rams from gaining momentum. The medieval equivalent of "you can't access there from here" was literally integrated into the edifice. The most ingenious deception was the sham gate, a convincing-looking entry point designed to lure attackers into an even more heavily fortified sector. Medieval trickery when that appealing access point proves to be a deadly snare. While the gatehouse constituted a formidable ground-level defense, a castle's full defensive capacity could not be achieved without utilizing its most obvious asset: elevation. Height provided a crucial advantage in combat, and medieval castle constructors employed this principle with devastating efficacy. The summits of castle walls and towers were sophisticated combat platforms designed to unleash lethal force upon assailants. The castle walls' most recognizable feature, crenellations, were not merely ornamental. The raised sections, or merlons, safeguarded defenders, while the gaps, or embrasures, permitted them to discharge arrows or hurl projectiles. Medieval master builders understood spatial separation centuries early, remained behind the masonry and fire through the apertures. Behind these ran the wall walk, a passage where defenders could traverse quickly along the periphery. These were wide enough for two armored men to pass without anyone clumsily plummeting off. Firing from above granted defenders a considerable edge. Longbowmen could discharge arrows from 200 yards distant, while crossbowmen engaged closer targets with armor-penetrating bolts. Some towers featured arrow slits configured to create overlapping arcs of fire. Heavier armaments included springalds, large crossbow-like devices propelling darts powerful enough to impale multiple assailants. Nothing unifies enemies quite like being pierced by the same immense dart. Simple physics created the most terrifying weapons. Weighty stones dropped from elevations of 30 to 60 feet crushed shields, headgear, and the individuals beneath. A 20-pound stone released from 40 feet strikes with the impact of a horse's kick. Defenders warmed sand or water. Contrary to common belief, oil was too costly for routine application, to pour through machicolations, stone projections with floor openings. Hot sand would infiltrate armor, causing excruciating burns, while scalding water could cause attacker fatalities. While these elevated defenses made direct assaults almost suicidal, determined attackers often tried to bypass walls entirely. This prompted castle designers to develop yet another crucial defense. Approaching a medieval castle was not as simple as walking up to the main entrance. Between attackers and those stone walls typically lay a massive excavation, the moat, creating a significant predicament for invading armies. Just when you thought assaulting a castle couldn't get worse, now you needed aquatic construction. Most moats measured between 10 to 30 feet wide and 5 to 10 feet deep. While water-filled moats were common, they were not solely about submerging foes. They prevented tunneling beneath walls, a method called sapping, as the water table would inundate any attempted excavations. They also compelled attackers to construct bridges or employ vessels, both dangerous options when projectiles were raining down. Dry moats were also effective. These deep trenches could contain sharpened stakes, metal spikes called caltrops, or, in warmer regions, even dangerous fauna. Nothing says deter quite like a trench filled with serpents. Some castle engineers took psychological warfare to new extremes by filling moats with refuse and decaying waste. The stench alone might make attackers reconsider their objectives. Traversing these barriers necessitated portable bridges or extensive filling operations where combatants would discharge earth and lumber into sections of the moat, all while being targeted from above. Drawbridges added another ingenious defensive layer. Operated by counterweight mechanisms or chains concealed inside the gatehouse, they could be quickly elevated to create an impassable chasm. Some advanced castles featured multiple drawbridges in sequence, creating several impediments to overcome. Interestingly, archaeologists examining Bodiam Castle discovered its impressive-looking moat was actually quite shallow in many areas, suggesting it was designed partly for appearance. Medieval lords understood that sometimes appearing formidable was half the struggle. While moats excelled at impeding ground assaults and complemented the wall defenses we previously discussed, any invaders who managed to navigate these watery death traps would next confront an even greater challenge. Medieval castle towers were not merely imposing stone constructions. They were sophisticated battle stations that regulated the entire defensive framework. Rising up to 100 feet tall, towers gave defenders the ultimate advantage of elevation and visibility. First and foremost, towers functioned as early detection systems. Lookouts positioned at the summit could discern approaching armies days prior to their arrival, employing smoke signals, fire beacons, or flag communications to alert the castle. The Tour de Constance in France featured a dedicated chamber for signal fires visible 20 miles away. Those medieval sentinels were like human traffic cameras, except instead of speeding tickets, they dispensed arrows. Tower design evolved significantly over time. Early square towers had a serious defect, blind spots at corners where attackers could operate unseen. By the 12th century, circular or D-shaped towers became customary, eliminating blind spots and rendering it nearly impossible for battering rams to locate flat surfaces to strike. These curved walls also deflected projectiles more effectively than flat surfaces. Strategic positioning was vital. Towers were typically separated by 100 to 200 feet, the effective range of a longbow, ensuring overlapping fields of fire where attackers would face arrows from multiple directions simultaneously. Try evading arrows from various directions while scaling a ladder. It's the medieval version of a very unjust video game. Inside, castle designers fashioned specialized combat platforms with arrow loops, narrow apertures that allowed defenders to fire while remaining protected. These openings were cleverly splayed inward, granting archers wide sight while presenting minuscule targets to enemies outside. Towers linked to wall walks, allowing defenders to relocate swiftly between positions. Many included spiral staircases curving clockwise, a minor but brilliant detail that granted defenders descending the advantage while impeding right-handed attackers ascending. With these imposing advantages secured, castle defenders still required one more vital element to withstand prolonged sieges. Once the gate slammed shut and the drawbridge rose, a medieval castle transformed from a stronghold into a self-contained community. The real challenge was not merely keeping enemies out, it was keeping everyone inside alive. The original confinement had nothing to do with pandemics and everything to do with avoiding assassination. Food storage formed the foundation of siege subsistence. Castle designers built vast subterranean storerooms called undercrofts specifically to contain enough provisions for months of isolation. These cool, dry spaces preserved cereals, legumes, and dried fruits, staples that could last through long sieges. Barrels of cured fish, smoked meats, and firm cheeses lined the walls. Most castles maintained food stockpiles to endure at least 3 to 6 months, with some prepared for a full year of seclusion. Dover Castle in England had storage capacity for a garrison of 100 men to survive for nearly a year. Medieval meal preparation was not about social media photos. It was about avoiding starvation while projectiles flew overhead. Water availability proved even more crucial than food. No matter how robust your walls, dehydration would defeat you within days without access to potable water. Castle builders resolved this issue by excavating deep wells directly into the bedrock beneath the central courtyard or keep. Some of these wells reached astonishing depths. The well at Crac des Chevaliers in Syria plunges 120 feet downward. Other castles collected rainwater in enormous cisterns that could hold thousands of gallons. The cleverest castle designers constructed their wells before erecting anything else, ensuring laborers had water during the years-long construction process. Nothing ruins your day quite like spending 5 years building impregnable fortifications, then realizing no one considered drinking water. Daily life during a siege occurred in confined, uncomfortable circumstances. The castle populace expanded beyond its customary size as peasants from surrounding territory sought refuge behind its walls. Space became scarce. Grand halls that typically hosted banquets transformed into shared sleeping quarters. Privacy vanished. Aristocratic families who usually enjoyed private apartments might share space with dozens of others. Medieval castle Wi-Fi would have experienced severe bandwidth problems, except the only thing streaming was the occasional drip from the ceiling. Sanitation presented another significant obstacle. Castle designers built latrines that discharged waste through chutes in the outer walls, a simple but effective system during normal periods. During sieges, however, these became vulnerable points that enemies could ascend or utilize to initiate blazes. Alternative arrangements included chamber pots emptied into designated waste pits in the courtyard. Some larger castles featured sophisticated systems. Pembroke Castle in Wales had a massive latrine tower that could accommodate 20 individuals simultaneously. Medieval architects grasped that no matter how luxurious your castle, everyone defecates. Health concerns accumulated as sieges protracted. Fresh vegetables rapidly depleted, increasing the risk of scurvy and other nutritional deficiencies. Physicians stored herbs and remedies, but their efficacy was limited by medieval medical understanding. Castle inhabitants relied heavily on brewing ale and wine, not just for morale, but because the fermentation process rendered these beverages safer than potentially tainted water. Beer sustained medieval defenders both hydrated and slightly more sanguine about being surrounded by adversaries. Since 1066, the psychological toll of siege existence cannot be overstated. Boredom, dread, and claustrophobia impacted everyone trapped inside. To counteract this, castle life persisted with structure and routine. Guards maintained regular watches, craftspeople continued essential duties, and religious ceremonies offered solace and temporal markers. Games like chess, dice, and backgammon helped fill the interminable hours of waiting. Being confined in a castle during a siege was akin to the world's worst holiday. Abysmal lodging, restricted fare, and the neighbors keep attempting to kill you. While the towering defenses we previously discussed kept attackers at bay, Sometimes castle occupants required methods to ingress and egress undetected. The most important portals in medieval castles were often those nobody could perceive. Behind massive walls and towers lurked networks of concealed pathways, hidden entrances, and clandestine tunnels that served as both emergency exits and tactical advantages. The original emergency exits lacked those irritating alarms, but they did occasionally harbor serpents. Secret escape tunnels, known as posterns or sally ports, enabled defenders to slip out unnoticed during sieges. These narrow passages typically emerged far from the main castle in forested areas or ravines. Dover Castle features a renowned example, a 200-foot tunnel through solid chalk cliffs that was not rediscovered until 1794. These were not merely emergency exits, they were medieval versions of ghosting an undesirable party guest. These hidden routes facilitated defensive forays. Small groups could covertly exit at night to damage enemy siege apparatus or assault sentries. Records from the 1216 siege of Dover Castle describe defenders using sally ports for nighttime attacks that dismantled enemy catapults. Most of these exits had multiple sharp turns to prevent enemies from surging in if they discovered the passage. Some castle tunnels served more functional purposes, connecting different structures within the complex. During peaceful times, these provided convenience. During sieges, they allowed defenders to move reinforcements rapidly without crossing open areas where they might be targeted. False passages represented a darker aspect of these systems, intentionally designed traps for infiltrators. Some led to dead ends where enemies would be cornered. Others contained concealed pits with spikes at the base. Crichton Castle in Scotland featured a deceptive escape tunnel that led to a submerged chamber where intruders would perish by drowning. The secrecy of these passages created vulnerability as well as strength. Several castles fell due to betrayal involving hidden entry points. In 1330, Nottingham Castle was breached through an overlooked tunnel from a nearby tavern. At Chateau Gaillard, attackers found an unguarded latrine chute that permitted them to penetrate the fortress. The castle designer who neglected to post guards near the washroom probably received a very unfavorable performance assessment. While secret passages offered crucial benefits during assaults, the ultimate defense remained the castle's capacity to withstand and counter the specialized siege weaponry that attackers employed against its walls. Medieval siege engines were impressive, but castle defenders were not simply passively awaiting destruction. They developed countermeasures that transformed attacking a castle into a deadly medieval chess game. When attackers arrived with battering rams, massive logs with metal tips, defenders would drop enormous stones directly onto them from the battlements. These were not small rocks. We are referring to boulders weighing hundreds of pounds that could splinter wood and crush unfortunate combatants below. The medieval equivalent of dropping a piano on someone's head, except no one received a comical tune at the conclusion. Fire was another preferred defender tactic. When siege towers, those massive wooden structures on wheels, approached the walls, archers would unleash volleys of flaming arrows at them. Defenders also used long hooks on ropes to seize the towers and destabilize them. Nothing ruins your day like ascending a 60-foot siege tower only to feel it suddenly tilting sideways like a drunk attempting to climb stairs. Trebuchets presented a different challenge. These colossal catapults could hurl stones from a distance, so defenders reinforced walls where impacts were anticipated and conducted nighttime incursions to sabotage these machines. Some astute defenders even timed the intervals between launches to forecast where to avoid standing. One particularly vile siege strategy was biological warfare. Attackers would sometimes catapult diseased animal carcasses over the walls. The defenders' counter-response, they catapulted some of the mess right back, along with beehives and wasp nests. Talk about returning undesirable gifts with interest. Countermining was essential when attackers tunneled beneath walls. Defenders dug their own tunnels to intercept them, flooding enemy tunnels with smoke or deploying attack dogs. Many castles kept specialized anti-siege apparatus ready, including wooden frames called hoardings that could be quickly erected to expand the range defenders could drop objects from. While the preceding section demonstrated how castles employed architecture to create death traps, these active defenses proved medieval defenders were not merely relying on thick walls. They retaliated with ingenuity that would impress modern military tacticians. And when all else failed, they always possessed one more potent weapon in their arsenal: resilience. Success in medieval conflict often depended on who could endure the longest. Castles transformed time itself into a weapon against attackers. Psychological warfare was a primary tactic. Defenders would feast on battlements, ensuring the aroma of roasted meat drifted toward hungry besiegers. Medieval taunting did not require words, just a chicken leg waved provocatively from a tower window. Sieges bankrupted attackers. A typical army in the 1300s cost approximately 500 gold pieces daily. After weeks of stagnation, many lords simply exhausted their funds. The siege of Kenilworth Castle endured 6 months before attackers capitulated. Weather favored defenders. Winter sieges were brutal for armies encamped outside. More soldiers succumbed from cold, illness, and hunger than from fighting. Castle inhabitants were not residing at a luxury resort, but compared to attackers sleeping in mud, they might as well have been. Castle defenders mastered sudden attacks called sorties, small groups rushing out from hidden gates to target siege equipment or supply routes before quickly retreating. Deception also aided. Headwear on poles made it seem like more soldiers guarded the walls. Trumpets and drums created the impression of reinforcements arriving. The most potent defense was often patience. About 60% of castle sieges concluded with attackers simply surrendering. While the previous section showed how castles actively fought against siege engines, this combination of patience and psychological warfare completed their defensive strategy, transforming stone structures into active participants in medieval power contests.